It's an honor, really, to be invited to speak at Sinn and Bedeutung, and I'm grateful to the organizers for the opportunity to talk about this work, which, as Igor said, is an integration of historical linguistics and semantics. It is especially an honor to be speaking in Göttingen. I mean, all of you know that Göttingen was the home of Gottlob Frege between 1871 and 1873. What not all of you might, or what many of you might not know, is that at that point in time, it was also a very, very important center for comparative philology and Sanskrit studies, and it remained so until very much into the 20th century. And in fact, during the time that Frege was in Göttingen, Jacob Wackernagel was also studying in Göttingen. He came in later as well to teach in Göttingen, and he wrote his work on Sanskrit grammar, Altindische Grammatik, while he was there. So it's kind of a twofold legacy here, and I think it's a great opportunity to be able to talk about the integration of two fields of knowledge which have been separate since then and are now starting slowly to come together. And that's the spirit in which this talk is constructed. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is the fact of semantic change in the functional lexicon, right? So in functional morphemes, tense, aspect, possession markers, and so on. The observation is that the meanings of such linguistic expressions change over time. And there is no a priori reason for meaning changes when they happen to follow systematic paths, right? There's no logical reason for this to happen. But when you look at the grammaticalization and typological research in semantic change, you see that there is a striking systematicity in the diachronic patterns that we observe in functional categories. And these are the properties that grammaticalization people have attributed to what they call grammaticalization paths or clients, right? So similar categories across cross-linguistic instantiation. So you see that across languages, perfects turn into perfectives. Across languages, location markers turn into possession markers, and so on. These trajectories are unidirectional, which means A goes to B, but B doesn't go to A, right? So you have unidirectionality kind of as part of the explanandum. Similarly, the observation is that they recruit resources from similar lexical domains. So for instance, locative markers get recruited to create progressive meanings, or they also get recruited to create possessive meanings, and so on. And the trajectories are often cyclic in nature, in the sense that when you get a generalization, when you get semantic change, that is often followed by innovation of new material, and a contrast is reinstated. And we'll hear about that in a few minutes. So these properties, you see, are they present a very interesting problem for semantics. Here's some examples of grammaticalization paths, and they're typically written in this way, right? So you have the progressive goes to the imperfective, the resultative becomes a perfect marker. So markers of resultatives get reinterpreted to markers of perfect aspect, and then they become perfective or past tense markers. So this is the kind of change that you see instantiated in Germanic, in some dialects of German, and in Romance as well. Expressions encoding location evolve into expressions encoding alienable and inalienable possession. And deontic modals diachronically acquire epistemic uses, but not vice versa. So there's the unidirectionality in there. Okay. So the very, very simple, obvious question to ask is, why should changes in grammatical forms that are disconnected across space and time exhibit such similar evolutionary paths, right? So that's an obvious question for any historical linguist and for any semanticist to ask. And then we can think about these changes in terms of what exactly is happening at the level of an individual grammar and what is happening at the level of a population's grammar. So how can we characterize the changes in meanings at the level of grammars of a population, right? So that's the question that I'm also interested in addressing. Okay. So if we look at phenomena, so these are observations, right, the changes that take place. Grammaticalization phenomena raise questions, three questions that I'm interested in talking about today and addressing today, which are directly relevant to the program of formal semantics and pragmatics. What is the semantic content that underpins any particular grammaticalization path. So whatever we see in language, what is the kind of semantic content that we are talking about? What logical relations characterize its members? So what is the relation between these categories, such as the perfect and the perfective, or the progressive and the imperfective, such that one goes to the other? So what logical relation defines its members? And what leads languages to innovate and generalize expressions along such a path? Okay. And this is part of kind of a broader integration of diachronic material into synchronic programs of linguistic theory. So in general, any theory of a system at a synchronic state has implications for diachronic transitions into and out of that state. And in phonology, this is just part of the explanandum. Diachronic patterns are taken to be what we treat as data in trying to develop phonological theories. And what I'm trying to say is that, in fact, that's exactly the case can be made that semantics works in the same way, and semantic change phenomena should be an integral part of the explanandum for semantic theories. And of course, there's been work on semantic change, especially in the starting from the first decade of the century. And Regina's work is seminal to that, integrating the insights of compositional model theoretic semantics with the facts of grammaticalization, and looking for ways of formalizing notions like the conventionalization of pragmatic inferences, which is a very, very integral part of recruitment. So how do new functional categories get created? And her work has been kind of seminal in that regard. There's work by Cleo Kondoravdi and me on looking at how the perfect to perfective shift takes place and how we can characterize meanings of the resultative, the perfect, and the perfective aspects such that the change is rendered natural. Igor Yanovic's work in his dissertation, he discovers a new semantic trajectory in the modal domain in which a variable force modal develops ambiguous readings and then turns into a necessity modal. So there has been work that is trying to integrate diachronic work with formal semantics, and there also has been work that is looking at the evolution of meaning from a more dynamic perspective. So Mattausch 2004 is one representative. It offers a bidirectional optimality theoretic model for the evolution of reflexive pronouns, the difference between him and himself from Old English to Modern English. Schad in 2012 provides an iterated learning-based model of the perfect to perfective shift. So in each of these cases, what is being addressed is the dynamic part, right? How do we get from one meaning to the other? And the work above is really kind of the structural part. What are the meanings that are implicated in the changes that we are talking about? So what we see, though, is that in this work, that there is a way in which people take particular problems and then try to go about looking at, how we are going to explain this particular phenomenon. And the collective work that has developed over this time kind of allows us to take a slightly higher view and think of things in terms of, well, what would a theory of semantic change look like? What are the essential ingredients to such a theory? And what I think that such a theory of semantic change ought to look like is, minimally, it has to have two components, what I'm calling the structural component. And the structural component of a semantic change theory would provide precise characterizations of what are the meanings that are getting grammaticalized, how they are related to each other. So this connects with the program of synchronic semantics and pragmatics, right? So what are the ingredients that we are talking about that are undergoing change in time? And what do we mean by what does it mean to say that meanings are changing? And this, for those of you who might be familiar with the seminal work of Weinrich, Herzog, and Labov, Empirical Foundations for a Theory of Change, which really pertains to the phonological domain mostly, this amounts to the constraints and the embedding problem. So the constraints problem is the problem of knowing what are the relevant ingredients of what are the possible changes that can take place, and what is the space that constrains these changes. The embedding problem is the problem of how are particular elements in a linguistic system, how are particular elements embedded in a linguistic system and how they relate to each other. And that's the constraints in the embedding problems for any theory of change have to connect to the structural component, so deciding what meanings are relevant. The other component would be the dynamic component, which would model how usage and transmission might lead to the recruitment and generalization of particular meanings. Right? And this is what Weinrich, Herzog, and Labov call the actuation and the transition problem. The actuation problem is the problem of how does, given that we know that certain kinds of changes happen, how exactly in a population would a change get triggered and then propagate, those variants propagate among a population. So the actuation and the transition problems would be handled by the dynamic component of a theory of semantic change. So what I want to do in this talk is to examine one particular change, the shift that is robustly attested in several languages from progressive to the imperfective, which means that a language innovates a marker of progressive meaning at a particular stage in time. This marker slowly becomes obligatory in certain contexts, which will become clear during the talk. And as it becomes obligatory, we have a clear division of labor between the progressive and the imperfective markers of a language. Over time, the progressive takes over, right? So the progressive generalizes, the imperfective disappears, the progressive becomes the new imperfective, and then the language innovates yet another progressive. Right? So that's the progressive to imperfective shift, which you want to think of as a cyclic shift, not just a one-way shift. And the cyclicness is that there's innovation of new material that creates a new progressive in the language. And the questions to be asked here are, what are the relevant meanings? How do these meanings interact with each other? And how might a population go from one meaning to another? And of course, when I say that the theory of semantic change has to be unified, I'm saying that the answers to all of these questions must cohere. They must go together. So you have to address all of these problems at the same time in order to kind of come closer to an approximation of what the facts might be. And this is, so it's an attempt at coming somewhat closer to the truth, right? It's not in any way even a close approximation to the truth. What I have here. Okay, so let's start with what I'm calling the structural component. So what are we going to look at? We're going to look at the semantics of the progressive and the imperfective, a unified way of looking at the cross-linguistic, of the contribution of the imperfective and the progressive operators that have multiple cross-linguistic instantiations, and try to come up with a way that kind of has maximal empirical coverage. Okay? So cross-linguistically, imperfective marking is associated with at least 3 distinct readings. There's the event in progress reading, right? So John is making dinner right now. He's in the process, an event is going on. The habitual or the generic reading, which I'm calling the characterizing reading. So John puts the baby to bed in the evenings, or John walks to school rather than taking his bike, or something like that. So which characterizes a particular, which describes a particular situation as obtaining regularly in regular episodes over a large period of time. And the continuous reading with lexical stative predicates, so something like John weighs 200 pounds, right? So you have these 3 readings that are associated with a single piece of morphology. In the English, with the simple present tense, in languages which have a very, very clear imperfective with imperfective marking. And this robust cross-linguistic tendency of these meanings to cluster together suggests a single semantic core from which these 3 meanings might arise. And here's an example for a language which has an imperfective that has these 3 readings. So this is Gujarati, an Indo-Aryan language spoken in Western India. So you have the imperfective marker with the present tense right there, that periphrastic construction. And you have Nisha is making bread right now. So you have the event in progress reading. Nisha roj rotli banave che, so Nisha makes bread every day, that's the characterizing reading. And with a lexical stative like live, you get Nisha navsari ma rahe che, with the same morphological paradigm, and that's what I'm calling the continuous reading. And it's interesting, it's important to note that this very same morphological complex, in fact, in Middle Gujarati was a progressive, right? So it generalized, it instantiated or exhibits the progressive to imperfective shift, in which this marker has now generalized to the general imperfective marker, originated as a progressive, as a marker of progressive meaning. Progressive marking is saliently associated with the event in progress reading. So you know the English progressive marking. So Mary was biking to work when she got hit by a bus. There was an event in progress thwarted by the incident with the bus, right? But it also gives rise to characterizing and continuous readings with an added element of temporal contingence. And this has been observed in the literature, that in fact when you use the progressive with stative predicates, or sometimes it gives with eventive predicates as well, what you get is a temporally restricted habitual or continuous reading. So for instance, you might say Mary was biking to work until she bought a car, and that's not an event in progress interpretation, but rather it describes a regularity that held for a restricted period of time. I would bum a ride off top, but he's riding the bus these days, not an event in progress again, but a characterizing reading. There's continuous readings of progressive marking, where progressive marking occurs with stative predicates. So I'm 8 weeks pregnant, and right before I got pregnant, I was weighing 187. Or who are you wanting to seduce? Right? So you have these uses of the progressive that somehow focus on the reference time. Okay. And this kind of data, as well as the cross-linguistic data, has kind of led people in the typological literature, and starting from at least Comrie 1976, the progressive has been treated as a subcategory of the more general imperfective. So pictorially, you want to kind of think of the progressive and the imperfective relation as being this way. The progressive is kind of some specific version of the imperfective. So there's a specific general relationship, a privative contrast that characterizes these two aspectual categories. And evidence for this relation comes from things like blocking effects. So for instance, note that in English, the simple present tense, if I say something like John bakes a cake, that does not get the event in progress interpretation. Right? In Middle English, it used to. So historically, the simple present tense was compatible with an event in progress interpretation, but that is something that is blocked in modern English by the robust presence of the progressive. So in order to describe an event in progress, we must use the progressive and say something like John is baking a cake, and not John bakes a cake, to convey the event in progress reading. So these are blocking effects which are robustly attested, again, not only in English, but in languages which have two grammaticalized devices. For the progressive and the imperfective. The second kind of evidence is generalizing diachronic shift. So this has been noted in the literature. So Bybee and Dahl work on tense aspect and modality changes over time. The grammaticalization work in this domain has shown that many languages show these shifts. Tigger, Yagaria, which is a Papuan language, Gujarati has exhibited this shift, a Chadic language, Marghi has exhibited this shift. So you have lots of data that suggests that there is a generalization process that goes on, and that kind of supports this. Let me try and use this. Oh, okay. All right. So, based on this kind of relation between the progressive and the imperfective, the fact that the imperfective has three readings, the event in progress, the characterizing and the continuous reading, and the progressive also has this range of readings, but in a restricted way, I suggested a unified semantic core for the two operators, the imperfective and the progressive, that builds up on earlier quantificational proposals that take the two operators to denote universal quantifiers over intervals. And the particular analysis that I proposed was kind of designed to handle diachronic change. So the idea is, well, let's have an analysis of these two categories such that if there is a change from one to the other, it becomes natural. right? And that's what I mean by saying that historical phenomena should constrain synchronic theorizing. You want these two things to go together. If A becomes B, then there has to be a synchronic semantics for A and B such that it is possible for A to become B over time. Okay? That's the constraint. So there's three main components of the proposal. The idea is that the imperfective and the progressive contain a universal quantifier, the two operators, whose domain is a regular partition of some interval. And by that I just mean a division of the interval into mutually exhaustive and non-overlapping sets of equal measure. And that will become clear in a second. The partition measure, which is the length of each cell of this regular partition, is a free variable. That's contextually determined. And the range of readings that are associated with the imperfective and the progressive marking derive from the variability in the partition measure. So just think of it that way, that the bigger the cell of a partition, the more likely you are to have a characterizing reading. And the smaller the cell of a partition, the more likely you are to have an event in progress reading. So that's the only variability that is offered here. And the contrast between the imperfective and the progressive has to do with whether the quantifier domain is a partition of the reference interval itself. So are we really chunking up the reference time into little pieces and trying to see if the property holds at each of these chunks? Or are we creating a regular partition over some superinterval of the reference interval? So those are the three main ingredients of this of the difference between the progressive and the imperfective. So just getting some notions in place. So a regular partition is, say R subscript I is a regular partition of I if it is a set of intervals such that it meets the properties of what a partition is, and for every cell of that partition, the measure of that cell, the measure of each of these cells is the same, right? So mu of j is equal to mu of k for all j and k in the regular partition. A small enough regular partition is a contextual notion again. It's a regular partition of an interval where the value, the measure of each cell does not exceed some contextual threshold. So what you want is for any reference interval, whether it's an hour-long interval or a century-long interval, you want to be able to create a regular partition over it such that the length of each member is small enough with respect to the entire measure. Right? So if you have an hour-long interval, a regular partition might be 5-minute-long subintervals. If you have a century-long interval, a regular partition might be decades-long intervals, right? So you want to be able to get that variability because you want to be able to say, John make impf pasta last evening and John make impf pasta last year. And those have two different readings. In one case, you have an event in progress. In the other, you'll get the characterizing reading. Okay? So the imperfective and the progressive operators are both universal quantifiers over the cells of a small enough regular partition. And that's your semantics for the imperfective. It says that it gives you a reference interval. It takes a predicate, gives you a reference interval such that there is some superinterval of which the reference interval is an initial interval, and for every cell of the regular partition, there is P gets distributed over each cell via this relation that I'm calling the relation of coincidence. And coincidence is kind of crucial because what you have here is that it simply means overlap if the predicate is an eventive predicate, which means there is an event of type P that overlaps with a particular interval. And if it is a stative predicate, then what you get is that the predicate holds throughout the interval. Okay? So that is a distinction that leads to different kinds of inference patterns for imperfective marked sentences with eventive predicates and stative predicates, and progressive marked sentences with eventive and stative predicates. Okay? All right. So the imperfective will combine with a predicate of eventualities P at an interval I, which is the topic time, the reference time, and it lets P distribute over the partition cells of some superinterval J of I. So if you look at this picture to help you visualize, you can look at the inner ellipse as being the topic time and the outer ellipse as being the superinterval of the topic time. And what you're doing is you are creating a regular partition over the superinterval and letting P distribute, and P is those little dots there, right? So P is distributing over every K, which is a cell of the partition of J. And that's the meaning of the imperfective. It's letting the predicate, whether it's an eventive or a stative predicate, distribute over parts of the interval. And it's really the semantics of the capturing the intuition of ongoingness, right? The predicate is spread throughout an interval. What does it mean to be spread throughout an interval? It means that it is being instantiated throughout big enough or small enough parts of that interval. So the characterizing and the event in progress readings of the imperfective will now depend on the context in which an imperfective sentence is uttered and the predicate, right, the underlying predicate with which the imperfective is combining. So the relative length of the interval will determine what a small enough cell is. So are you talking about large intervals or small intervals? If the interval is long compared to the time required for predicate instantiation, then we get the characterizing reading. Right? So this is if you say something like John makes pasta and you have a long interval under consideration, then all parts of this interval contain pasta making events. And if it is rather short relative to the typical duration of event being described, it takes maybe 45 minutes to make pasta. So if the interval we are talking about is kind of short, then what you'll get is the event in progress reading, because every small part of that short interval has to overlap with a pasta making event. Most likely it's the same pasta making event, and that's really what the event in progress reading is, that there is a single event that distributes over, whose time overlaps with every partition cell. That is the event in progress interpretation. Okay. So the progressive differs from the imperfective only in one respect. It restricts the domain of quantification to a regular partition of the reference interval rather than a superinterval. So the only difference that you see there, okay, I'm going to just use my mouse, okay, I don't like this. Okay, so what you have, the only difference is that we are now considering cells of a partition of the reference interval I right here. And we are saying that P distributes over the partition cells of the reference interval, right? So that's the only difference. In one case, you're saying, here's the reference interval, P holds throughout the reference interval. In the other case, you're saying there is some superinterval of the reference interval, and P overlaps with every part of that. That's the only difference between the two. And one of them is a more specific version of the other, because the imperfective is compatible with the superinterval being exactly the same as the reference interval. So that's the semantic distinction between the progressive and the imperfective, such that the progressive operator comes out as a special case of the imperfective operator. Okay? Now there's two pragmatic outcomes that come out of this particular organization of the semantic categories. So conceptually, all I'm saying is that the aspectual domain of imperfectivity is somehow divided in this general specific relation. There is a specific version of the imperfective, the progressive, and there's the generic version, the general version of the imperfective, and these two are related to each other. One of them blocks the other, and things come out of that. Okay? So there's blocking effects. So notice that in a language that has two grammaticalized devices for the progressive and the imperfective is not going to give you event in progress readings with eventive predicates. So this is the observation that John makes pasta or John bakes a cake does not receive the event in progress interpretation. The second observation is, the second outcome of this is that we have upper bounded readings when the progressive is used in those cases when the imperfective is expected. So when you use the progressive with stative predicates, John is living in San Francisco, I'm weighing 187 pounds, New Orleans is lying at the mouth of the Mississippi, which sounds horrible. This is Doughty's example. So you get these temporal contingence inferences that this is when the predicate holds, not anymore, right? So this is an up-bounded reading for progressive with stative predicates. And both of these can be derived just out of the interaction between the progressive and the imperfective together with the contribution of eventive and stative predicates. Okay. How long do I have, Igor? Oh, okay, not bad. Okay, so let's try and see if we can derive the blocking effect. So given any eventive predicate, P eventive, subscript eventive, and interval I, prog Pi, right, which is a proposition, asymmetrically entails inf Pi. The reason is that if it is the case that the eventive predicate distributes over the reference interval, then it follows that there is a superinterval J of I, presumably the same interval, right, the reference interval, because the superinterval relation is not a proper superinterval relation. So there is a superinterval J of I such that the eventive predicate distributes over J. Okay? The reverse does not hold. If there is a superinterval over which the predicate is distributed, this superinterval might be very, very large, and therefore it might not be the case that the reference interval can be also chunked up into small pieces such that P distributes over all parts of it. So the reverse does not hold, and what you have is that a proposition of the form prog Pi when P is eventive is always semantically stronger than inf Pi. Okay? It denotes a smaller set of words. That's the observation. Now take any language that has fully grammaticalized devices for the progressive and the imperfective, so a language like English or a language like Hindi. And in such a language, if you have the utterance of an imperfective sentence, so something like John bakes a cake, right? Then what the speaker has done is utter the weaker alternative, because the progressive is the stronger alternative when you have an eventive predicate. And that implicates that the speaker does not believe that the progressive version is true. So in a sense, the speaker has said that the eventive predicate distributes over a superinterval of the reference interval. This means that the speaker does not believe that the progressive predicate distributes over the reference interval itself, which gives you the further strengthening. The speaker believes that the progressive predicate, the progressive alternative is not true, and that gives you the further strengthening that the progressive alternative is not true. And so you get that the imperfective is true and the progressive is not true, and the interpretation is that the P is distributing not only over a superinterval J of I and W, but over a proper superinterval, right? So P distributes over some proper superinterval of the reference interval. And this entails, there's a further step in logic that I'm not going to go through here, but this entails that the imperfective expression will not receive an event in progress interpretation, okay? And that is what is captured, that is what captures, that pragmatic reasoning is what captures the absence of an event in progress interpretation for John runs at this moment, John laughs at this moment, or John bakes a cake at this moment. Okay. Now we move on to stative predicates and look at the temporal contingence effects. Notice that with stative predicates, if we say that a predicate coincides with an interval, we mean that a predicate holds at that entire interval, and which means that a progressive sentence combined with the progressive operator combined with the stative predicate, the contribution of the two is exactly the same, right? So prog P stative I, if and only if, the imperfective is P stative I, if P holds throughout an interval, if a stative predicate holds throughout some interval, then it follows that there's a superinterval such that the predicate holds throughout it. And conversely, if a predicate holds throughout some superinterval of the reference interval, then the predicate holds throughout the subinterval, right? So that is the way that stative predicates work. If P holds at a larger interval, then P also holds at a subinterval if P is stative, okay? So the progressive and the imperfective versions in the case of stative predicates are informationally equivalent. They do exactly the same things as far as their semantics goes. Let's make a general assumption that given equivalent meanings, there's a preference for simpler utterances. The imperfective utterance or the imperfective expression is morphosyntactically simpler than the progressive expression. And in English, this is clearly the case. One is periphrastic, one is synthetic. In many languages, in fact, because the progressive is diachronically newer, it has more morphosyntactic complexity than the imperfective. So let's assume that in fact in in languages in general, the progressive marking is going to be complex, is morphosyntactically more complex than imperfective marking. And if, as in the case of stative predicates, they give you equivalent meanings, then there'll be a preference for the simpler version to be used, which means that if a speaker utters the progressive version, so if a speaker utters a sentence like, Mary is living in San Francisco right now, then, then there will be a pragmatic reasoning process set into action. The idea is that the speaker used the morphologically more complex expression. There is a reason for the speaker to use the progressive rather than the imperfective, which means that the speaker does not believe that P holds at a proper superinterval of I. That's the contribution of the imperfective. It allows you to distribute a predicate over superintervals of the reference interval. And the speaker does not believe that P holds at a proper superinterval. That gives you the inference that P does not hold at a proper superinterval. And that gives rise to an upper bounded reading that the predicate P holds at the reference interval, but does not hold at superinterval. So that is what amounts to the temporal contingence interval. P holds now, but not at a superinterval of now. And so that's what gives you the oddity in the cases where you expect the predicate to hold at larger intervals. So you expect New Orleans to stay in place, not move around, and what you get is infelicity when you have New Orleans lie at the mouth of the Mississippi River combined with the progressive, because the upper bounded reading of the progressive kind of kicks in and says only now, okay, not tomorrow. So that's the effect of, and that's the temporal contingence effect of the progressive in a language which has both the progressive and the imperfective competing with each other in a semantic domain, stative predicates, where the two make equal contributions. Okay. So to come back up again, what we have done is to kind of give a meaning for the imperfective and the progressive such that they are minimally different from each other. One of them is a specific version of the other. The semantic difference between the two really lies in the interval that supplies the set. Is it the reference interval over which we are partitioning and distributing the predicate, or is it a superinterval of the reference interval, right? And then the difference between the available readings for infant progs is kind of crucial to note. The imperfective does not have event in progress interpretations. When you use the progressive with stative predicates, you get the temporal contingence interval inference. So all of these all of these effects are really coming from the pragmatic relation between the competition between the alternatives that are generated by the progressive and the imperfective in combination with eventive and stative predicates. Are you with me so far? Okay. This is the structural part. Okay. So this is what is the semantics such that change can happen. Okay. So we come back to the questions for today. What is the semantic content underpinning any particular grammaticalization path? And what logical relations characterize its members? And those are the two ones that I've tried to address with the structural explanation or the analysis for the progressive and the imperfective. Now, what we'll look at is the third question, which is what leads languages to innovate and generalize expressions along such a path? So we have these meanings, right? We have the meaning of the progressive, the meaning of the imperfective, they live somewhere, and speakers lexicalize these meanings, they produce these meanings, and over time, they change in this systematic way. One goes to the other, new material comes in, you get this grammaticalization mill, so to speak, right, through which lexical material is passing through in a very predictable way. So now let's look at the diachronic path kind of pared down, and we can identify 4 logically distinct states in the cyclic grammaticalization path that is associated with the progressive and the imperfective. Right? The first stage is where there's a form X that has imperfective meaning. It realizes the imperfective operator. And let us call this stage the zero prog stage. Okay? There is no prog in the language. This is a language like Arabic. This is a language like Turkish, as it is changing when the progressive actually is becoming the imperfective at this point in time. Then you have a language in which there is a progressive, so there is a new form innovated, but this form is kind of not obligatory in the way that the English progressive is obligatory, right? Where the imperfective does not receive an event in progress interpretation. So, and that I'm calling the emergent prog stage. The prog is kind of in the process of coming to surface in the language. That's the metaphor. And then the third stage is the blocking stage, in which there is a progressive, there is an imperfective, two distinct grammatical devices, one of which blocks the other. So the progressive blocks the imperfective from particular interpretations. And that is what I'm calling the categorical prog stage, where prog is categorical in domains. And the fourth stage is when X disappears from the language and there is an imperfective and Y, the original progressive, becomes, right, turns into the imperfective in the language. This is the progressive to imperfective shift as it has been observed, and this I'm calling the generalized prog state. Okay? And note that if you look at them structurally, A and D are identical except for their formal exponents. In the zero prog stage, there is no progressive. In the generalized prog stage, there is no progressive. The progressive has become the imperfective. Nothing left to mark progressive meaning. Okay. So there's three observable diachronic steps that need to be accounted for here. The first is the recruitment of existing morphosyntactic resources in order to innovate a specific functional category. So recruitment is in fact the work that the transition that Regina has done most work on in terms of understanding how categories like the prospective aspect or NPIs in natural language kind of get created through inferences that are licensed in context. So the first step is the recruitment of existing resources to create something like a prog that will contrast with an existing imperfective. The categoricalization of prog, that's the second stage, to obligatory use in certain contexts which originally required the use of an inf. And the generalization of this progressive and its use in all contexts associated with the imperfective. So that's the shift part. The generalization is the shift part. So these are the three steps that we need to understand better. Okay? We won't understand them today, of course. Each stage of this cyclic path that we see is a typologically possible grammar, right? So if you look at zero prog, that's Arabic and Russian, a language without a progressive. Emergent prog, that's the Romance languages in which there is a progressive with the imperfective. It is possible to use the imperfective to describe events in progress. So that's the Romance type grammar. A categorical prog system in which you cannot use the imperfective in domains like, when you have an event in progress reading, it is impossible to use the imperfective in those cases because progressive must be obligatorily used. That's the categorical prog system. And the generalized prog system, which is instantiated by ongoing changes in languages like Turkish and Tigr and Yagaria. Okay, so each of these stages, I mean, this is just logical, right? Each of these stages has to be a possible grammar because there is no way that any diachronic transition is going to generate an impossible grammar. Right? Okay, so the diachronic question in the domain of the progressive and the imperfective is how does and why does progressive marking arise, become obligatory, and then generalize to imperfective meaning over time? We can generalize this diachronic question, of course. Why, how do new functional expressions emerge in an existing linguistic system, become entrenched as obligatory elements in that system, and change in meaning over time? And this is just a special instance of that question. Okay. What I'm going to try and say today is that recruitment which is the innovation of the category, categoricalization, the obligatorification of that category, becoming obligatory in certain contexts, and generalization are best viewed as transitions between alternative grammatical strategies for expressing salient sub-meanings within a particular semantic domain. So there is a semantic domain, there are some salient sub-meanings, and these can either be recovered contextually or they can be lexicalized. And that those very different strategies for recovering those meanings are what give rise to the effect of a grammaticalization path. So that's the deconstruction here. Okay? So I'm going to start with a notion that never quite took on, that comes from a paper by Goldsmith and Voigt-Schlager in 1982 in Linguistics and Philosophy. And they talk about the contrast between phenomenal and structural meanings. Okay? So they say there's two broad kinds of facts about the state of the world. And communicating either type of the fact might be goal of a given discourse. That's what I'm saying. So there's structural facts. There are stable facts and generalizations that characterize in some relatively timeless way the actual world. So things like dogs bark, bishops move diagonally, John smokes Cuban cigars. So these are structural facts. They define the structure of the world. Yeah. And phenomenal facts are facts of more local import, right? These are contingent facts that pertain to specific times, the events that occupy such times. We're interested in what is happening and not what the case is generally, right? So dogs are barking, or dogs ruined my lawn yesterday, if you use the past tense. John is smoking a Cuban cigar, or John is making pasta. I mean, all of these kind of things, which are very, very local descriptions of local, temporally contingent events. Okay. So their idea is, and I think it's a very tantalizing idea. I wish one could make much more concrete sense out of it. But for the moment, I'm just going to kind of take this idea, the phenomenal structural contrast, and go with it, see where it takes us. Okay. So they say the structural phenomenal contrast is a fundamental classification of the types of knowledge that we possess and acquire. And the idea is that language and the conceptual structure that underlies language distinguishes between properties that are seen to contingently hold of the world. They say they're attributable to the capriciousness of nature, and properties that hold non-contingently or essentially of the world. This is a contrast that is salient for our cognitive systems. Okay? And there are ways in which this salient contrast can then map on to the linguistic system. Okay? And that's what I'm going to suggest, that the phenomenal structural contrast is a salient one from the conceptual perspective. The linguistic system may either rely on a contextual disambiguation of this contrast. Do I mean now or do I mean generally? It can do so contextually, or on the basis, or have formal disambiguating markers in order to do that. Progressive marking in a language allows it to disambiguate phenomenal meanings from structural meanings. We can distinguish between the things that happen now, that are happening, that are ongoing, that are attributable to the capriciousness of nature, from the things that hold generally. And that is what progressive marking, with the semantics that it has been given, allows us to do, right? Because it makes reference to the reference interval. It tells you what's going on at the reference interval, and therefore it allows a language to disambiguate phenomenal meanings from structural meanings. Any language that realizes both the progressive and the imperfective can now conventionally restrict the use of the imperfective for structural inquiries. So you have a marking coming up in the language that allows you to express phenomenal meanings. Over time, the language can undertake a division of pragmatic labor in which one is reserved, the progressive is reserved for phenomenal meanings, and the imperfective is reserved for structural meanings. That, in fact, is the categorical prog system, the one that is instantiated in a language like English. Okay? So these options that you have, you can either contextually disambiguate the contrast, you can innovate a progressive. Once you've innovated a progressive, you can divide the labor up between the progressive and the imperfective. These options give rise to, they kind of correlate with distinct strategies for communication within the imperfective domain, and each of these strategies have distinct profiles. And we'll talk about 3 relevant strategies, which are essentially 3 typological grammars. There's the zero programmer, in which the speaker uses a general form, imperfective. The hearer is relying on context. Do you mean phenomenal? Do you mean structural? Which one? Let me guess. Okay, and of course I have the context to help me guess. So I'm not kind of interpreting by chance here. The emergent programmer, in this case, the speaker uses a general imperfective when the context can allow the hearer to disambiguate between phenomenal and structural meanings. So the speaker is kind of interpreting the properties of the context. Is the context rich enough for the hearer to determine whether I mean John is baking a cake, or I mean John bakes a cake? Which one do I mean? If the context is rich enough, then I'll use the general imperfective form. If the context is not rich enough, the speaker uses the specific progressive marker. And this is what is the emergent prog system, in which the progressive gets used but not categorically. It only gets used optionally. Okay? The categorical programmer is the third strategy, in which it's an entirely form-dependent strategy. Right? The speaker uses the progressive to mark phenomenal meaning, and the hearer interprets the progressive as marking phenomenal meaning, and the speaker uses the imperfective reserved for structural meaning, and the hearer also interprets the imperfective accordingly. Right? So you have 3 grammars. One of them is a context-dependent strategy for encoding and recovery of submeanings. The emergent programmer is partially context-dependent. It requires the speaker and the hearer to be attuned to the context, but it's also partially form-dependent. So there are disambiguating strategies in the language. The categorical programmer, which is the third strategy, employs a form-dependent strategy in which phenomenal meanings are expressed using the progressive and structural meanings are expressed using the imperfective. The hearer will recover meanings accordingly. If the hearer gets a progressive, he'll interpret it as phenomenal. If he gets an imperfective, he'll interpret it as structural. Okay? So those are the 3 possible ways of recovering salient submeanings within a particular semantic domain. And notice the idea is that the grammaticalization path is an emergent effect, and the emergent is different from that emergent. It's an epiphenomenal effect of the fact that any of these strategies can be used by speakers, and the ways in which these transitions take place. Transitions between strategies take place in a population. Okay. So you can take these strategies, 3 distinct strategies, and model the whole system as a game, right? And using game theoretic models of communication that have been developed again in the last decade of this. So just like formal semantics and historical linguistics came together in the first decade of this century, we also have very detailed work that has been developed in game theoretic models of communication and application to several synchronic phenomena. In fact, not to diachronic phenomena yet, but that's a natural extension, and that's the one that I'm attempting here. Okay, so the general idea is that the utterance situation is modeled as a game between the speaker and the hearer. The speaker aims to convey some meaning to the hearer through her utterance, and the model is going to specify possible choices of signals for the speaker, possible interpretations of those signals for the hearer. So you've already seen that. So in a categorical programmer, for instance, the speaker has prog and inf as 2 signals. The hearer has very specific ways of interpreting those. Prog has to be interpreted as phenomenal and inf as structural, and so on. So these are particular strategies that are construed in terms of speaker strategies and hearer strategies. And the solution concepts will predict how the game is played out, given preferences for signal economy, simpler systems, of strategies with less forms, for instance, and successful communication. How likely are you to get at the meaning that the speaker intended, which is especially relevant in a context-dependent strategy, because you have to guess, right? However, good you are at determining the context, you always have to guess, and you're going to be wrong some of the time in a context-dependent strategy. Okay. So, so the key idea here is, and I'm not going to walk you through the entire structure of the game here, but the key idea is that if you look at recruitment, the innovation of the progressive, categoricalization, the becoming obligatory of a progressive to mark phenomenal meanings in a language like English, and generalization, which is the prog to inf shift, these amount to the successive adoption of these three grammars, three different grammars, the zero prog, the emergent prog, and the categorical programmer in a fixed sequence by a significant proportion of the speech community. So they have one, then the other, and then the third, and then the first, and the second, and the third, and there's certain assumptions. You need to make a lot of assumptions to get it to work in that way, but I'll tell you all the relevant assumptions that I'm making here. Okay. So the grammaticalization path then can be reconstructed as an emergent pattern in which alternative communication strategies of these three rise and fall in dominance over time. Okay. And before we move to looking at how this happens, we'd say, well, why? Why would such cyclic fall-rise patterns in strategies happen? Why would it be the case that speakers have first a contextually dependent strategy, then they move to an emergent prog grammar, then they move to a categorical prog system? And one part of the explanation is going to be the relative expressiveness and cost associated with alternative strategies, right? So you can think of these three grammars in terms of how expressive are they and how costly are they. A zero prog grammar is more economic, one form, but does not guarantee communicative success, you have to guess. A categorical prog grammar, which has prog for phenomenal meanings, imperfective for structural meanings, guarantees communicative success. You're not going to be wrong if your hearer has the same strategy at work, but it's costlier, two forms. And an emergent prog grammar is somewhere in between, right? Relies on context, but also uses the second form some of the time, not all the time, right? So that's kind of the three-way distinction in terms of expressiveness and cost. The second reason is, the possibility of mislearning a target grammar from the properties of the acquisitional input. How likely are you, as a child, to look at the input that is given and interpret some other grammar other than the one that its parent has? And we can see some structural properties of these kind of grammars. So if you have a contextually disambiguating grammar or a zero prog grammar, the speakers of such a grammar may undertake local efforts, right, to disambiguate between phenomenal and structural meanings. For instance, they might say, I'm making a cake right now, or I'm in the middle of making a cake. And they can use expressions like that, which are morphosyntactically explicit efforts, and these may be taken as evidence for an emergent prog grammar. So some acquirers might understand such local efforts to be, in fact, conventionalized and interpret a new functional category, prog, on the basis of such efforts. So such efforts may be taken to be evidence for an emergent prog grammar. Input from an emergent prog grammar in which speakers are using the progressive but only some of the time may provide evidence for a categorical prog grammar, especially to an acquirer who's 2 years old, 3 years old, and not really used to being attuned to context. Such a speaker might understand an emergent prog system to be evidence for a categorical prog system and simply generalize. If you say prog, you mean phenomenal meanings. If you say inf, you mean structural meanings. As the frequency of the use of the progressive increases, acquirers may fail to acquire the categorical prog grammar because of the frequency of one form in their input, and I'll talk about this in a second. So there's ways in which target grammars, acquirers may mislearn target grammars that would lead to a cyclic pattern of the strategies. Okay. Okay, so essentially what I'm going to look at is the evolutionary dynamics in which these three strategies are kind of the the things that populations are programmed for. Every individual is programmed for a particular strategy. And what we see is how do the frequencies, in evolutionary dynamics, what we see is how the frequencies of strategies within a population change in time. And this is determined by the success of these strategies in terms of their expressivity on the one hand, how good are they at at communicating the right facts, and how bad are they at being acquired, right? That's the combination that determines how the frequencies of strategies change. So for any strategy, this will depend on the relative payoff and the likelihood that the strategy is a target of mutation, that conditions exist for this strategy to be misacquired. Okay? And the particular dynamics that we'll be working with is the replicator-mutator dynamics, which is also called the language equation, which determines the rate at which any strategy changes in frequency over time. And there are three main ingredients. Okay? We're not going to look at the equation. There's three main ingredients: payoffs. What is the payoff for each strategy as it plays against other strategies? The composition of the population. How many of zero-prog players are there? How many of categorical prog players? How many emergent prog players, right? Those are the three strategies. So who is playing against whom, and what are the payoffs with respect to that? So it depends on the proportion of a population that has a particular strategy. And mutations. What is the probability of mislearning? Okay, so those are the three ingredients that go into the equation. And here is basically the payoff matrix that I have been assuming for this, and we can talk about this during the question period. And this is the mutation matrix that I've been assuming, which tells you the probability that the offspring of a row player, right? So what is the likelihood that a zero-prog player misacquires an emergent prog strategy? And that likelihood is 0.07, right? So 7% of zero-prog player, offspring of zero-prog player might acquire the emergent prog strategy. So this is the structure that goes into the evolutionary dynamics that I've been able to create for the progressive to imperfective shift. And this matrix kind of assumes an ordering of the three grammars on a scale of difficulty from the perspective of transmission. So the idea is that the emergent prog grammar is the hardest to learn because it's a combination of context and form. And then it's the zero-prog grammar, which requires contextual attunement, and the categorical prog grammar, which is simply a form-dependent grammar. Okay. So what we get here, if we kind of simulate this kind of a game with a population, with a particular population, is a pattern in which there's a single equilibrium that emerges. So you can start with any frequency for any strategy, but you end up with this equilibrium. In this case, what we have is, I'm going to try this again. Okay. Okay. So this red line that you see there is the zero-prog grammar. Do you see the green line? The green line is tracking the frequency of the emergent prog grammar, and the blue line is tracking the frequency of the categorical prog grammar, right? So we could have started with each strategy having 33% share, so 0.33 share in the population. We just started with giving this one, the zero-prog grammar, a 100% of the share of the population. Okay, so all the speakers are programmed for the zero-prog system. So this is an extreme version of Old English. Old English is not really like this, because the idea is that all strategies are always in the population, and you will never reach this kind of a, I'm just going to use my mouse, okay. You're never going to reach this kind of a system. So you have something, this is time, of course, and that's the frequency, right? So you start with a population that is entirely a contextually disambiguating population. The salient sub-meanings are determined by context, recovered through context. And through mutations, what you get is the emergence of the emergent prog grammar. Right? So the emergent prog grammar takes over. That in turn leads to mutations into the categorical prog system, which, because of its payoffs, because it is communicatively the most successful, kind of takes over. And we reach an equilibrium at which the categorical prog system is at something like 77% of the population, and the two other strategies kind of go to around 10% of the population. 10, 11% of the population. Okay, so if you put in all the ingredients, the mutation matrices, and the payoff matrix, and so on, what you get is a game that is played out in this way, and what you have is a single stable equilibrium, and the dynamics just lead to this equilibrium for any initial conditions that you might take. Okay. Now this creates a problem. I'll take like a few more minutes and then stop. This creates a problem because the cycling behavior from zero prog to emergent prog to categorical prog is in fact takes you back to the zero prog state, right? And that's a mystery. Like, how do you go back? You know, you stay there, you have a progressive and an imperfective, and then you stay there forever after, right? With a formally disambiguating system throughout. But how does a population, to the extent that these observations are real, how does a population repeatedly move away from the only stable equilibrium in the game and comes back towards it, right? So how does this happen? So I'm going to make an assumption, which is a leap. I don't know anything better than this, is that the cycling behavior obtains because it is difficult for the population to maintain this equilibrium. So what I'll assume is that as a categorical prog system increases its share in the population, as more and more people start using the progressive for phenomenal and the imperfective for structural, mutations out of this system increase because the total quantity of the progressive forms that are produced in the grammar increase, and acquirers are more likely now to interpret this system with a heavy preponderance of the progressive as actually being a zero prog system. Okay? So as the share of prog marking in the child input increases, children increasingly fail to acquire the categorical prog system. And this is kind of, this idea is kind of modeled in a brute way in this particular system. I'm just going to say that if the categorical prog population exceeds 0.77, then the mutation rate kind of from the categorical prog system into the zero prog system. So more children start using the single form strategy because there is so much progressive around. Okay, so we'll talk about this in the question period too. And then this increased mutation rate persists, and that gives you the effect of a cycle. So you know the strategies. Red is the zero prog, green is the emergent prog, and the blue one is the categorical prog. And you see as the categorical prog increases in the grammar, as it becomes more, at this stage when it reaches a particular threshold, mutations increase, which lead to the zero prog grammar kind of emerging higher, having a larger share in the population, which then further, as the emergent prog system increases, you have a new form and you get a new categorical prog system. And so a cycle occurs because at the equilibrium level, you have increased mutations from the categorical prog to the zero prog system. Okay. I'm going to kind of skip this for now. So to kind of conclude, what we see is that the grammaticalization path that's observed in the domain of imperfectivity is amounts to transitional steps within the strategy space of an imperfective game. Of the three particular strategies that we are talking about, the zero prog, the emergent prog, and the categorical prog strategies, which differ with respect to whether you have contextual recovery of meanings or explicit marking of meanings. A population contains each of these strategies in some proportion at any given time, and mutations are continuously occurring between the strategies. And cyclic behavior is the result of the dynamics, and because of increased frequency of the disambiguating strategy has to go hand in hand with increased mutations out of that strategy. This is just a way of modeling inflation in the dull sense, where you just keep using a form that does some work for you, and then it loses its value and it gets generalized. Okay. Beyond the progressive to imperfective shift, I want to say that in fact, this is not just a claim about this particular grammaticalization path, but if there's any semantic grammaticalization path in the functional domain which shows this cyclic pattern, such a path must be underpinned by some semantic contrast a privative contrast between a specific and a general meaning. So in fact, I think the Jespersen cycle, emphatic negation and plain negation, the perfect to perfective shift in which the perfect is a special version of the perfective, each of these contrasts are the kind of contrasts that can give rise to a path, because such a path has to be underpinned by a specific general type of contrast. Okay? Changes in functional domains that are characterized by such contrast are cyclic, because these domains are structured as games which give rise to equilibria which cannot be maintained, because increasing frequency of the specific form also goes hand in hand with increased mutations out of the disambiguating strategy. And the actual occurrence of such paths would of course be a language specific fact. It would depend on the cost of multiform strategies, threshold values for grammaticalization, all of these kind of things which would be language specific. But in general, what we have is the key basic ingredients for both the structural component and the dynamic component of a grammaticalization path and semantic changes that seem to be cross-linguistically attested over languages. So, that's it.